Hey there, today is Monday, October 12th, 2020. My name is Matt Fury, and you are listening to The Rough Cut. All right, listen up, Rough Cut Nation. This one's going to be a little different, which I hope you like. If you've listened to even a handful of the episodes of this podcast, you know that even though the shows are predominantly about picture editing, we do often discuss sound design and sound editing. A while back, I even did an episode on sound design. That one featured Will Files, Eiling Lee, and Craig Hennigan, who are all sound designers and re-recording mixers. And people really seem to like that episode. So why not do one on sound editing? And that's what this episode is, a little tour of the world of sound editing. And we're going to begin that tour in Wellington, New Zealand to visit with sound editor and software developer Justin Webster. Justin's career got off to a slow start with a little film called The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, where Justin was an assistant sound editor. Apparently, Peter Jackson liked what he heard because Justin would return as sound effects editor for all 3 films for The Hobbit. Along the way, he wore many hats as dialogue editor, sound designer, re-recording mixer, even foley artist, as well as doing the dialogue editing for a truly unique film and an awesome movie called District 9. I tell you all this to demonstrate that Justin knows his way around audio post-production. So much so that he could not only identify the pitfalls and gaps in the modern audio post workflows, he could also develop his own tools to help overcome them. His company, The Cargo Cult, offers tools for working in surround and doing sound design, all with fun names like Envy, Spanner, Slapper, Stem Cell. And now he has a new one called Matchbox, which is designed to address and improve all the versions and changes that projects go through, often right up until the last minute. And not just between picture and sound, but also between picture and visual effects. And if that doesn't prove the point that necessity is the mother of invention, I have a couple of other mothers to introduce you to. As our tour in sound editing will then take us to Los Angeles, California to meet Kami Asgar and Jessica Parks, 2 sound editors involved in what could be some game-changing technology that they're currently using for the upcoming films Ghostbusters Afterlife and Venom Let There Be Carnage. This technology is called the Virtual Mixing Environment, and it's being developed by Sony Research and Development. So what does it do? Well, it's probably best to let Kami and Jess explain it, but basically it enables you to reproduce the sound field of a real-life studio or soundstage through headphones, which even without this whole new work-from-home situation we're dealing with sounds like a pretty amazing and useful thing. Kami Asgar has been working as a sound editor in film and television for many years on just about every type of project you could imagine, but Jess Parks is a bit of a different story. She began her journey as a sound editor, but soon had a very successful career as a post-production supervisor and on some pretty big movies. Now, I don't know if a lot of people would have the nerve to do this, regardless of the job market, but she decided that working in sound is what she truly loves and has returned to that path. And just in time for her to help develop Sony's VME technology. So, lots to talk about today, and we better get to it. Now, seeing as how this episode is all about sounding great, who better a sponsor to have than Extreme Music? Now, what you do is you go see my friends at Extreme Music for your next project, whether it's a movie or a series or a documentary, maybe a docu-series. And they will help you find and license the best production music from the best artists that make it. Quincy Jones, Hans Zimmer, Michael Giacchino. Not bad, right? All you have to do is go to extrememusic.com and tell them what you're looking for. They make it super simple to search for the right style, tempo, sub-genre, I don't know. Anything you can think of, they'll find it for you. And they've been doing this since 1997, so clearly they know a thing or two about making your next project sound great. You know what else would sound great? Talking to our guests today. So pack your bags, we're off to New Zealand. Time to meet sound editor Justin Webster. Now back here in New Zealand, it's like...
Yeah, there it is again.
There it is again. That's what happens. Well, the there it is again part we should talk about a little bit. I mean, so many of the discussions I've had lately with picture editors, with sound post people, is about this transition to remote editorial and working from home and figuring out how to do all that stuff. How would you feel about doing sound editing at home? Is that something you could do if you had to or wanted to?
Yeah, I've done it in the past, in smaller jobs where it didn't warrant everybody being in a big facility. And you can certainly do it for, for dialogue and foley. There's really no reason to not cut at home. I know a lot of dialogue guys cut on headphones much of the time, so that really is no problem. There's the collaborative aspect, which you lose, of course. And for sound effects people, for sound design, it's difficult to work in stereo. There's a limit to what you can achieve, especially in a small room at home. So for bigger projects and sound design stuff, I'll definitely try to move back to the studios.
Are there certain trade-offs that you have to make? You mentioned just the collaborative part of it, which I have heard before, that just the difficulty of interacting with other people, going through revisions, different iterations of the project. But are there specific trade-offs, sacrifices you have to make when working at home?
These days, a lot of people, when they cut, edit sound effects and sound design, we're sort of cutting and pre-mixing at the same time. And it's really useful to be able to do that because you're making choices based on how they're going to work in context with the rest of the film. But you can't really do that unless you've got a decent environment you can trust. So, personally, I'd probably stop short of that kind of pre-mixing work unless I was in my regular room. So that's definitely a limitation. That's going to probably cost the production more money down the track if they have to pre-mix everything else later on in a big dub stage.
Going through your IMDb page, you have a pretty diverse background in audio post and a diverse background in the types of projects you've done. And I want to get to that in a little bit, just about the different hats that you can wear in audio post. But one thing I want to try and do is draw a distinction or a comparison between picture editing and sound editing, at least in terms of your interaction with the director. Now, an editor and a cinematographer, they would meet with the director to get a sense of the style of the film, the look, the tone, the theme even. How does that work with sound editors? Do you have those same meetings with the director, and what kind of direction does a sound editor get from a director?
We do try to get that meeting, the spotting session. Sometimes it is just a really brief meeting and maybe they point out a couple of key things that we couldn't possibly know from having read the script. Sometimes you'll get a proper spotting session where we watch the entire film and we get detailed notes on certain characters and how they should sound, points of reference, other films. But I'm sure we probably, we don't get nearly as much time or as much direction at that stage as you guys would in picture editorial. Something we could always use more of, I think.
Continuing on our discussion about directors, you've worked on some very big films, most notably the Hobbit films with Peter Jackson, and also one of my favorite films, District 9 with Neil Blomkamp. How would you compare working on an indie film with a relative newcomer like Neil versus working on these humongous films like the Hobbit films with Peter Jackson?
The main difference right away is just access to the director. Those really big directors like Spielberg and Peter Jackson, they're just flat out 7 days a week for a year or whatever. So it's very difficult to get in front of them or even get a question in front of them. Whereas a guy like Neil, he's making effectively what was an indie film at the time on a really small budget. So it's a lot easier to get access to him. And it also means that if he's working on such a small budget, he's having to make more decisions from the outset. He can't have 5 versions of that visual effect shot. He sort of has to make decisions right up front, and that makes it a lot easier for us in sound because, if everything's left to the last minute, then, it's just a bunch of work that has to be done all at once.
You talked about an indie director not having, with their limited budget, not having the freedom to have so many different versions of things. How does that translate to you? Are there things that you have to give up or certain changes you have to make because of a smaller budget?
We don't get budget to go recording helicopters and rocket ships and whatever else. We get smaller crews, although, sometimes it can be a benefit as well, having a limited number of options. Smaller budget and smaller crew, smaller mix schedule means you really have to make a bunch of decisions about what you're going to cut and what you're not going to cut. On the bigger shows, it can kind of get out of hand as well. You end up with too much material in the final mix because of having to have options and because visual effects shots that you haven't seen yet don't arrive until you're print mastering. Yeah, that stuff can be difficult to manage.
I mentioned your IMDb page and all the different hats that you wore.
Yeah.
In looking at audio post, there's so many different types of jobs that you can have. Sound editor, sound effects editor, dialogue editor, foley editor, music editor. Do your skills translate across the different roles? If you have experience in one role, does that automatically mean you're qualified for the others?
To some extent, yeah. It's the technical skills are all the same. Everyone's pretty much working in Pro Tools and we could do each other's jobs at a push. And some people do work across all of those different job descriptions. But there is a bunch of really quite specific knowledge in each of those fields. So I'm normally working in the sound effects side. I'm sure I could jump in and cut a reel of dialogue right now, but if I had to prepare the M&E session, I'd probably have to phone a friend and figure out how that's done these days. Foley editing and sound effects editing, there's definitely a lot of crossover there. Between dialogue and sound effects, there's also crossover areas, areas where we have like a creature vocal or a character with a processed voice. So, yeah, there's always areas where we have crossover.
So depending on which one of those jobs you have, and let's go back a minute where, I asked you about where you start with the director. You mentioned the spotting session. Depending on the role that you have, does that change where you begin in the overall process?
On the very large films, such as the Hobbit films, there were two of us that started very early during production. Basically, as soon as we became available, we were on the Hobbit show, just listening to the production dialogue that was coming off set, giving feedback, working with the production sound recordist, creating sound effects or finding sound effects for the cutting room to use. So just like a sound post-production presence right from the get-go. I mean, on a smaller film, especially on like a small budget indie films, you're not going to get that. And you'll generally try to come on around about where there's a rough cut maybe, so in time to do one temp mix. On those small films, you bring on pretty much everybody starting more or less the same point. We may have Foley editor may just come on for a short period in the middle or towards the end.
Is there a ladder or hierarchy in the roles of audio post? Certainly the function of being an assistant to somebody is a starting point, but within those different types of roles, is one considered more of a good place to break into the film and TV business in the audio departments?
I think it is just that assistant role. It can be difficult enough to get onto a show as it is. So, I mean, if an assistant position comes up in any of those departments, whether it's assisting on the dub stage or dialogue department or recording Foley or whatever, any foot in the door is a good way in.
So you talked about getting sound ready for picture. And that's something that comes up all the time in these discussions is how much audio work is being done in picture editorial. Do you feel like more sound work is being done in picture before it gets to you? And how do you feel about that if that's the case?
Yeah, I'm sure the tools in Media Composer are probably getting better. And you've got more tracks to work with, but I don't know if many picture editors are going to be putting all that much time into it. I mean, clearly, most of that work's going to have to be done in Pro Tools at some point. I mean, I would hope that picture editors are just, focusing on the story stuff and not handing over 32 tracks of options.
I got to tell you, Justin, some of the people I've talked to, they seem like frustrated sound editors or sound designers because they love to get in there and do all that stuff. And
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it's great. We always want to know what the intention is coming out of the cutting room. But, if you've got 16 channels of lapel mics recorded for a scene, it's going to get pretty unwieldy. So we're happy to wrangle that stuff for you.
The other thing that gets brought up a lot is not just the design and the temp audio and all those things, but also the monitoring in picture. And it's funny, some people are just like, they sort of echo what you just said. I cut in stereo. I don't want to think about anything but the picture. Really, that's my job to tell the best story. And as you said, a lot of that stuff's just going to be blown away in Pro Tools and redone anyway. And then you have people that say, listen, I'm trying to get a more cinematic experience in offline. I want to do at least LCR or 5.1.
Mm-hmm.
So we know there's a lot of discussion going on in picture about what kind of surround to do. For you in true audio post, you have things like Dolby Atmos. So how have these iterations or evolutions in surround sound affected your role in the big picture?
Yeah, for us, I mean, not that much has changed in the time I've been in the business. So when I came in, we were already in 5.1 and 6.1, and we've been through 7.1 and now Dolby Atmos. So I mean, these are effectively small changes from my point of view. We don't really cut so much in an Atmos format. We may create a few things that we know are going to be used in the ceiling speakers or whatever, but in terms of the cutting rooms playing in surround, I mean, it'd be great for us to be able to give temp mixes through to the cutting room and know that the director's hearing our work in surround. That would be wonderful. Because as I said, with the big guys, it's hard to get access to play them stuff regularly. So the cutting room is often the best place to give them exposure to the new sounds. That said, I don't think I've worked on a job where the cutting room was playing surround.
Well, there's still time, Justin.
There is.
So one thing that I'm fascinated about, artists that actually sort of see a need for development of tools to go out and develop their own tools. And you've done just that with your company, The Cargo Cult, largely focused on true audio work in Pro Tools, but you have a new one called Matchbox, which I thought was pretty interesting because it does speak to this constant issue of how picture and sound collaborates, it communicates, and even beyond just picture and sound, just the multiple iterations and revisions that go on in a project and how challenging that can be to manage at times. So let's just start with what drove you to become a developer, and then we'll get in a little bit more to the Matchbox part of it.
Yeah, so I started just working on the films, but I've kind of always been that guy on the crew that messed around with scripts and wrote small tools to solve problems. And so early on, after the Lord of the Rings stuff, I started messing around with a reconform tool, a way of comparing EDLs and finding picture changes. That's recently just been end of life. Since then, couple of plugins, the spanner, the surround panning tool. That was just, again, just filling a hole. I didn't love the Pro Tools surround panner, and I thought there was a way of doing this better. Slapper, again, just another hole in the tool set. For mixing and surround, I often had 2 or 3 stereo echoes set up, and then I'd pan one to the front and one to the back, and it was just fiddly, and it was clear that there was a better way of doing it. So I did it, and that was Slapper. I've since had Stem Cell, which is a surround filter, EQ. Envy, which is like a morphing sound design kind of a tool for music and for sound effects design. And then, Matchbox, which you mentioned earlier, which effectively replaces Conformalizer, the old Reconform tool, but it's much more of a pan post-production tool. So change management for pretty much anyone downstream of picture editorial.
Which is basically everybody.
Yeah.
Which is why it's such a big problem not to have something like that worked out.
Even on the picture editorial side, you've got people who are scratching their heads about, which visual effects which visual effects shots are different, and what did we do 6 months ago in that cut, or where was that scene that we cut out? Yeah, it's a problem that seems to be getting worse. With computers getting faster and software becoming more capable, changes can happen later and on a grand scale. Even small indie films seem to be wall-to-wall visual effects. And, those tend to arrive at the last minute or later than that. So it's definitely a problem that everyone's experiencing and that we're trying to solve.
In becoming a software developer, a product designer even, did you learn more about your own craft or find new ways of just doing your job that you hadn't thought to do before?
I do get a lot of emails from people asking where a certain feature is. And it's usually because there's some whole other way of working that I hadn't even considered. I'd never come across. You get that when you work in teams. You see someone using some feature in Pro Tools or Media Composer, and it's been there for 20 years, and you had no idea it was even a thing. So that's been cool. Yeah, and it's also means we have to be kind of flexible about the feature set. We have to sort of stop and think about this other group of people who are using it in a different way.
Speaking of using things in a different way, and this is a little bit of a left field, even more so than some of my other questions, but any words of advice or good places for people to start that have their sights set on being a picture editor, but should develop good best practices for working with audio?
Well, for one, don't go down a rabbit hole trying to denoise or declick or spend too much time trying to cut sound effects in Media Composer. It's just that much easier to do it in Pro Tools. If you feel that way inclined, then by all means, fire up Pro Tools and learn that tool set.
Do you feel like you could be a better sound editor knowing how to do some at least basic picture editing and vice versa?
Yeah, I think there's definitely advantages for both of us learning the other tool set. I made a short film years ago, just kind of to skill myself up in that whole process. And I've spent a bit of time going back and forth to Media Composer, whilst developing Matchbox. For one, it helps you understand the language because it is different. Concepts that a picture editor might just assume are available in Pro Tools and they're not, and vice versa. Yeah, it's definitely worth spending some time in the cutting room if you can.
So before we got going and we were just sort of doing the casual chit-chat part of this, we were talking about other editors, other post-production professionals that we knew in New Zealand, Australia, and just the question that you face of, do I want to build a career in post-production in my home, New Zealand or Australia, or do I need to move to Hollywood to really grow my career? Being based in New Zealand, I guess what I would ask you is what kind of direction, if any, do you think you could take your career if you were based in LA versus being back in Wellington?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot more opportunities in the States and LA in particular. The locally produced content down here in New Zealand is very small budget staff and few and far between, apart from that one notable large client. So it does make it a bit tricky down here. There are often long stretches in between good gigs, partly because Peter has this wonderful infrastructure down here and makes great big films. We've got quite a large team of skilled and talented people who are sort of kicking around in between those big films looking for something to do. So we do get a fair bit of work from offshore, and we can work remote now, of course. We've kind of always been able to do the remote stuff because of our location. But yeah, without a doubt, anyone who wants to move to LA is going to find a lot more opportunities and more regular work, of course.
Well, whether it's specific to the actual craft of sound editing and all its different flavors, or just the career in general, what's your favorite part of your job?
It's probably that early part of the process where you've seen some rough drawings and you're coming up with concepts, recording stuff and just throwing ideas around. It's before anybody's had a chance to judge your work. It's before you've seen the finished visual effects. So that's kind of the fun, creative part of it, which quickly fades, of course, once the music comes in and you realize there's no room left. And it turns out the director doesn't like most of what you've done or whatever.
So in your job, what's the one thing that you wish people understood better or knew more about what it is you do? So when somebody goes to see a movie and you're sitting there with them, what goes into your mind thinking, if they only knew what I have to do to make all this happen and make it look so easy?
Well, yeah, the obvious one is that the lay audience has no clue how much has been replaced, how little of what they're hearing was shot on set. And I'm sure picture editors are well aware because they hear just the raw tracks. But even from your point of view, you're probably not aware of how much work goes into the noise reduction and carefully piecing together a nice, clean, continuous dialogue track. So it's a crazy amount of work that goes into one of those big films in particular. I doubt the lay audience would have any appreciation for that.
Well, I appreciate it. I have this podcast here, and I don't know if you know any sound editors that aren't busy, but I could use some help.
I think I know someone.
Okay, no time to edit the podcast yet. We're not done. I'll tell you more about Justin and the Cargo Cult software at the end of the show. For now, we head to LA to meet Jess Parks and Kame Asgar. Pants? Who wears pants anymore anyway?
Well, I got a good one. Last night, somebody broke into my car. Like, I didn't break in because I left it unlocked.
If you can laugh at a time like this, Kame, you're in a good place.
Well, it's all because of Jessica, not because of me.
Kame can always laugh. That's exactly that's exactly one of the wonderful things of having him around.
Well, we should just end it right there. Well, let's talk about a few things. Ghostbusters Afterlife and Venom 2.
Yes.
Not coming out this year, which really stinks because I really could have used both those movies this summer.
Yes.
We're going to have to wait a little longer. But you both are involved with some really groundbreaking stuff that I think is worthy of talking about in advance, especially considering the way this year has gone. This whole Sony virtual mixing environment is a new thing to me, and I imagine a new thing to a lot of people.
Yes.
So if you wouldn't mind, start us off with a little explanation of exactly what this thing is.
Well, to start off, they've been working on this technology for a while, and Smythe has a version of a 5.1 setup, which is sort of an external box. So this has sort of been a thing that's been going on for a while. But what happened was the pandemic happened, and Tom McCarthy, the head of the sound department at Sony, called me up and said, hey, you're working on films that are going to be mixing on the Cary Grant. We have a modeling set up for these headphones that we've been testing for, the last couple of years. Do you want to try them out while you're at home? And, meantime, I've been cutting in my garage. It is not a fun garage to be in. It's, it's like a 1940s house, and we have our washing machine and dryer and the air conditioning units in there and all that.
I've seen it. You were on the elliptical and everything.
Oh my God, you saw that. Yes, so I'm on the elliptical.
And on the phone at the same time.
Yeah. I think that was the longest I was on the elliptical through the pandemic. So anyway, it's really tiring to cut with headphones, just regular headphones. And I started cutting with headphones only because I had speakers and stuff set up in that room. But, my kids are at home doing homeschool stuff, and my wife is running her business from home, and me blowing up cars and stuff like that in the garage just doesn't work well with them. So I had to wear headphones all the time working. So I'm in the room for 9-10 hours a day cutting on headphones, and it was extremely tiring. And, the phone rings, and it's Tommy, who barely ever calls me anyway. And hey, do you want to try these on? And I went down to Sony. They put things inside your ear. They play sounds, and everybody's wearing masks, and it's kind of funky. But they send you home with this thing, and now I'm able to hear what everything sounds like as it was in the Cary Grant Theater, which is, it's not an exaggeration. It really is that way. You absolutely think that you're sitting in that space. It's a little weird because of the fact that you're sitting in the garage. But I had a picture of the Cary Grant on my screen as my screensaver. So I would look at that and it reminds me of this space. And I'm like, because we've worked in that room a lot, but it puts you in that space and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. That's those speakers over there. And that's where that wall is. And So it's amazing. It really is amazing how close to reality that is.
It's definitely jarring at first when you're sitting in a small room, but you're hearing a big one. So
I have to ask a follow-up question. They put these things in your ears. I think if anybody at home is listening, they're like, they put what in your ears? So Jess, what exactly do they put in your ears to develop this technology?
yeah, the calibration process is really cool. So they sit you in the sweet spot of the theater, and they put these little sensors, which are sort of little, very tiny, teeny tinier than earbuds or earplugs that you've ever worn, on a little spring, a little gentle spring. And you sort of push that inside your ear. And they play a test tone from all of the speakers sequentially through the room, and they measure how your ears hear the sound through those speakers in that room. So you've got sort of 3 levels of circumstantial way that you would perceive the sound. I'm assuming it's an impulse response or something similar to that, so that they can then take the sounds that you play through Pro Tools after that, run it through this filter just like a reverb plugin does. And what you're hearing is the way that it sounds in that space to you specifically. So if I were to put on Kami's setting on my headphones, it would sound completely different because of the way that he hears.
Yeah, especially, like, by mistake, they sent Kevin O'Connell's presets to me, and I just put it in because they constantly send you updates and stuff. And I put them on, like, and I called up Gil. I'm like, dude, this sounds so weird. This is, like, so off the mark. It's not even funny. Like, things are coming out of, like, the wrong places.
But he's really good. You would think it would work great.
It does.
Now I hear how he hears. It is, and he hears things really differently. All of a sudden, I think I'm going to get nominated for another Oscar because of that. Essentially, now I can hear things.
When I was reading up on this, I came across this term, head-related transfer function. Can you explain exactly what that component of all this is?
What did you say?
Yeah, so apparently it's not important for the actual user. Head-related.
That's a great term.
Moving on. Head-related transfer function. I guess that's the science behind what's happening here, what you just described.
Nobody said that to me.
Nobody said it to me either. I can only guess, because that's also the first time that I've heard that word. But my guess is that that's sort of a
We're being
term.
punked.
Yeah, we're being totally punked. So let's just lean into it. So here's definitely what that means. Head-related, literally of your head and your ears, informing that impulse response filter. I don't know, what is the word I'm looking for? Processing. Yeah, it's the sound processing. It's a name for the sound processing based on how your head is shaped, how your ears are shaped. And a lot of
placement
factors.
of your ears to your head and all that,
Now, I would assume these have to be, yours are set up for the actual Cary Grant mix stage at Sony.
It's very specific. Like, so yes, you model the model of the room. So you could be in any room. They could, do that part of it. The other part of it is the headphones themselves. Like, I have 2 pairs of prototypes. One has a larger diaphragm, and they're trying to work this stuff out, like what's the speaker they're going to put inside it and all that. So every time you put this thing on, and it's a different set of headphones, they have to recalibrate the headphones to your ears. So, like, I have another pair of Sony headphones, and we used to have the Sennheiser headphones. Mm-hmm. Those were all modeled differently, too, so you have to actually get those tuned to your head, too.
So this process you go through with the sensors, it almost sounds like little mini microphones they put in your ears.
That's exactly it.
So.
Maybe that's what the head-related transfer function is, mini
maybe.
microphones. So that process does 2 things. It calibrates for the room, but it also calibrates for the specific headphones you're going to be wearing.
For the speakers that you're actually... See, the sound, that we play a tone through the speakers. It's just this rising tone from, 20 to 20 tone. That they play through every single speaker. So the placement of it and what it sounds like when it comes to your head. And then the next step is you put on the headphones and they play the same tones through the headphone speakers. So then, so now you know what these particular headphones sound like. When I change this out and I put on my normal headphones and use the function that was cast for these headphones, they sound completely different. It might sound bassy or they might sound really trebly. Where this, whether I put on the 50 millimeter ones or the 40 millimeter ones, they sound exactly the same. They sound exactly like they sound in the Cary Grant. It just carries a little bit more of the sub frequencies and the bigger diaphragms. but it sounds exactly the same. Like the dialogue and all that sounds exactly the same.
So you two are actively involved in the development process in terms of giving your feedback and letting them know how this is working. Meanwhile, doing two very big movies. I mean, Ghostbusters Afterlife, Venom 2, lot riding on both of them. Those are the kind of films where we don't want to mess around. We want to make sure we're getting everything just right. How confident were they to jump right into this new technology for those very big films?
It was sort of left up to us, like whether or not we want to use it for this. Would you put in the time? And realistically, the difference for me as far as cutting and the time it takes to deal with this part of it is very minimal. From day one, it sounded great. There was a little bit of hiccups of like the plugin and how the plugin works, and they wanted feedback like, hey, what would it make it better? And anything that we said, the next iteration of it would have it in there. So we're actually making things, changes into this plugin and the software and all that, just based on little bits of input, like going, hey, this button, if you did this, would be cool. If we had meters on it, it would be cool. So you just know what you're listening to and all that. And the next time around, they're like, oh, that sounds cool, we'll do it. And then they would take care of it.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of tried out was, by default, I'll set it up by letting you know that when we shut down Sony and everybody started working from home, that was before I had been personally calibrated. So I had been to a couple of demos on the lot, especially when they were working, especially as one of the post executives there. They showed it to me as as a vendor almost, not as an intended user. And then when I flipped over to the sound department, we shut down and went home before I had a chance to get measured. But they didn't want to leave me out, so they gave me a set of profiles, 24 profiles that they had taken from other people. And they said, why don't you give one of these a try? Just listen to them all. Whichever one makes it sound more spatialized in your room, go with that. Whichever one makes it sound more like you can tell the distinctive speaker. So I sat at my dining table and I played through one by one, listening to every virtual, I'm making air quotes, virtual speaker, to see if it felt like where it was supposed to be. And I chose one that felt like it was pretty close to a big room.
And whose head was that?
I don't know. Number 19.
Number 19.
Head number 19 is the big winner for me. So I used that actually for maybe the first 3 or 4 weeks, just sort of on faith. But I enjoyed using it just because it was fun. It's so fun to feel like to hear your movie just feel a little more alive in that big space, even if it's a virtual space. And the tracks that I made dropped in well, which is good. But when I went and I finally got calibrated, it was clear to me what a vast difference it was between just sort of not random, even my best guess at something that would work for me was still quite inaccurate after I got calibrated and then heard it exactly as it was meant to be. So it's very specific. They would love to make it something that was a little bit more plug and play, a little bit more you can choose from A, B, C, so that it was more accessible to people who couldn't go to the space and get tested there. I'm guessing they'll find a way to make that a reality at some point. But as of right now, it's really, really most useful when you have gotten individually calibrated. That being said, I feel very confident saying that even a version of this that isn't exactly calibrated, but is still kind of roughly close, gets you closer when it comes to collaborating with your team than not.
Than just plain headphones.
Exactly. And what we were trying to achieve with Ghostbusters for most of my summer, and probably with Venom as well, honestly, before this is all over, both of these movies will go to the Cary Grant in person for the final mix. So what we're dealing with the headphones is these interim stages where we're all just trying to stay working in the same workspace together as much as we can to save time for the mixer down the line, making corrections and fixing things, because when we made it and heard it, it was one way and it'll sound all out of whack on the dub stage, which happens all the time. That's part of pre-dubbing, is that you get things back into whack.
Has anybody had a chance to listen to what you've done on the Cary Grant mix stage to see how the discrepancies between, like, okay, how did the work that Kami and Jess do translate to the actual Cary Grant theater?
I cut a reel of Venom, and what the process is, we'll cut some stuff, hand it over to Will, who's going to be doing the final mix. We were doing temp mixes to send to the studio and the director for them to review the work and stuff. So based on one of our deadlines, I had to cut a reel, and the process, would go to Will, and Will would actually mix it, and then we'll send it out. But in this case, we're so far behind that Will turns around to me and goes, Akami, I don't have time to mix this reel. And I go, you know what? I'll just go through it. I've been placing it with the headphones and stuff. I've been placing it. I'll go through it. I'll just do a quick pass and send it off to you while you do the dialogue. This was just on the sound effects, big effects reel of the movie. So I did the thing, sent it out to him. We sent it out to the director and all that. And the next day, we just happened to be on the Cary Grant for the VMEs, I think, to get recalibrated or something. And so we played that reel back so he could hear the dialogue and the music that he had mixed along with the effects that I'd mixed. We were so close, it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. Like how, and I only spent 20 minutes mixing this thing. Usually we spend a day just roughing it in. You know what I mean? It is amazing how you can actually play something on your computer in your edit room and then go out and play it in one of the biggest dub stages in the world, and for it to sound perfectly exactly like how you heard it in your room on the stage. And, we had this conversation with the development guys for, Jess having the number 19 or me trying out Kevin's. It is still, if you take a regular set of headphones and how that compares to the Cary Grant Theater or a referenced, a tuned room, essentially, is maybe within 5% of what it would sound like on a dub stage on a regular set of headphones. But when you put these headphones on, even with number 19, that's not even your head, you're 75% there. It literally sounds like you're in that room. It's not 100%, but it's, it's close. But then when you get it mapped to your ear and your headphones and all that, that takes you to about 95% accuracy.
It's really close. It's some spooky sound magic.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot that's really exciting about this. One of the things that I'm hopeful for, and I guess we'll find out, if I'm an indie filmmaker, is there a way that this technology translates or scales down to me where I can use this technology to do my small film and then take that to you guys? And who cares? Spoken like a true Hollywood vet.
If it's not a big $100 million movie, why are you even bothering? Seriously.
So many of Kami's clients are indie filmmakers.
I literally last night finished a movie that I did as a favor. I mean, and it's like a Sundance movie. But realistically, it does transform. It actually, here's the thing. If you remember, we used to work on film, and then computers were introduced. And it sort of opened it up. And that's sort of like when I opened up my first studio, it became accessible for somebody to spend $20,000 or $30,000 and build something that studios were doing with millions of dollars. Now, for $5,000, you can buy a computer and do sound on a film and edit a movie or whatever. Or even like cameras, the same thing with cameras. You can buy a consumer camera that's 4K and go shoot a movie. This enables you to mix a movie, hearing it exactly like how it would sound in a reference room, in a room that, Dolby came in and spent an entire day tuning the speakers for them to sound perfectly, natural. So that enables anybody to go and buy a pair of headphones and put them on and have that quality of sound and then play back for their clients the same way. You can send it off and they can be sitting in their bathroom watching their movie and going, wow, this sounds amazing.
I hope they won't be, but...
Yeah,
Those indie filmmakers, that's what they do.
I think I have an idea who broke into your car the other day.
Yeah, who's an indie filmmaker?
So, Jess, I saw a really cool video of you demonstrating this technology in your dining room. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're working on a very big movie with this cool new technology, but it seems like a pretty simple setup. So could you describe a little bit about what the gear was, what you had set up there, what you needed to do this?
Yeah, well, it happened so quickly, as you can recall, that on a Friday, it was a don't come back Monday to the lot. So I didn't have the studio furnished gear that I had at Sony. All I really had was just whatever I had at my house, plus these headphones that they were like, hey, these are the right headphones at least. Here's here's some settings. Good luck. And I had a MacBook Pro that was connected to a headphones amplifier because it doesn't have enough juice to really power the headphones you need to use it, and connected to drives and a second monitor. And that's really all I had to work with. I didn't have an Omni, I didn't have HDX, I didn't have anything that I would wish for in a more professional setup, and that later Sony did find a way to get set up for me safely. They sent an engineer over, and now I have a bit more gear since I am working on their big movie, which I'm sure they will promptly collect as soon as I'm done. But it did not take a lot of technology at all. The plugin itself, if you've got enough to run Pro Tools for whatever you're working on now, you've got enough juice to add the plugin without any problem. For me, the big challenge was the headphones levels, I'll be honest. At first, trying to power them out of my MacBook Pro just wasn't cutting it. The level was much too low. So I did need to use it in conjunction with a headphones amplifier, which they aren't expensive. I think I bought one for $40 off Amazon, and just gives me a little more juice. It's no Omni, don't get me wrong. Now it's much more powerful, and you can really feel more control when you've got a little bit more. You can raise the gain to get up to where you're used to hearing it. Because the other thing about the Cary Grant is it is loud. So if you want to really hear everything all together the way it's gonna play, you really crave that juice. So once I had that, I was in a really good spot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting in my edit bay right now, and I have a 5.1 setup with JBLs and whatnot. And I've completely switched to cutting with these headphones because they actually replicate my smaller dub stage, which is actually a smaller Atmos. It's both for television and for features. And I've done, like I was telling you before, I've done 6 or 7 movies now during COVID. And I prefer to work with the headphones rather than the speakers and all the stuff that we put into these edit bays, only because it's much more closer to what it would sound like on a dub stage or on your television and all that, because they are tuned. They're actually tuned to hear all the frequencies and all the nuances of, like, say, like a dialogue piece. It replicates a dialogue for me to hear all those little things that you're going to hear on your 5.1 setup at home. You can hear in these headphones. You can hear them crystal clear.
Yeah, they're really a pleasure to use, honestly. I also do indie projects on the side, and some stuff is never really intended for the big screen. Like right now I'm working on a web series, and I have to remind myself, honestly, to turn it off and listen to what it'll sound like in regular headphones, because that's going to be what people will hear that format in. But it feels almost more authentic with the plugin on when you feel like you have this room around you. It adds space to your mix, which in headphones, for better or worse, you don't have the room as part of the experience.
What about the type of film? It's, whether it's an action movie or a comedy or a drama or a musical even. Like, how would this impact something like that?
What I'll tell you is an early mistake I made this, part of it is just because I'm quite new to working in sound, is that I really drenched a lot of my Foley and a lot of stuff in reverb, because it felt like it made it sit more comfortably in my mix early on. And then as soon as I put the headphones on, I was like, oh my gosh, this is just reverb everywhere. It's so unnecessary, because once you have the room to play off of, you realize that that space lets a lot of things sit in more comfortably and naturally without you having to cram a bunch of echo onto it to make it, not stand out as so dry. So it helped me clarify my mixes and simplify them. Because and even with the stuff that I do that's only intended for a near field headphones mix, I still listen to it with the plugin on to do exactly that, to check for things that are going to stand out if they play it off of a TV screen or something where there's room involved. Is it going to sound way out of whack when you add space?
So understanding that you're both part of a bigger machine, Other than the calibration component of it, that extra work, how does this technology affect the people that you work with? Are there any changes up or downstream from what you're doing that have to be taken into account? Do your colleagues have to change their roles or their skill sets a little bit to accommodate for this?
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easily, like, we all kind of collaborate with each other as far as our sessions are concerned. So you work on a session that's going to, somebody else has already touched, you're going to touch it, the next person's going to touch it, and then it's going to go to the dub stage, and people you don't even know are going to look at it and open it and touch it. In the meantime, you have this plugin that's just sits inside it and virtually makes no difference to anybody outside of that stream. If they're not using it, it won't even affect them.
I'd make the argument that it's actually easier to collaborate using it because it equalizes your listening environment, if that makes sense. Our ears are all different. They're still all different if we're all listening to different headphones. But this plugin, after being calibrated, accounts and adjusts for your ears. So that all of a sudden, when I send something to Kami and we're both listening to it through VME, more likely he's hearing it the way I heard it than if I'm just using my headphones and I send it to his headphones.
Talking about this independent film that I just did, we're mixing on a dub stage, and we've been on this movie, like literally it's been in my hair for 2 years. And so we're doing a final mix, and this is towards your music thing. The director wasn't happy with this piece of music that they had. So, on a smaller budget movie, you sort of take on hands for everything. You just want to make sure that they get through it. So I sat there and took other pieces of music in a matter of like 5 minutes that I had to come up with something that's going to make the scene work for the director. So I put on the headphones. I can hear exactly how he would hear it on a dub stage. All the nuances inside that music, and there's cellos playing, there's violins playing, there's like little bits of piano in there, and horns and stabs and all that. And, I go back to the stage and play it for him, and he's hearing it on the dub stage, and I was hearing it on my headphones. There's no guesswork. I literally pressed play, and he was like, wow, that sounds great. And it sounded exactly like how I thought it was going to sound on the dub stage. Previously to that, I would cut 4 or 5 different versions because I would never be sure what it sounded like. Even if I did it in my room without the headphones, walked on the stage, it always sounds different. What you do in another room and you come to a reference stage, it always sounds different. No matter what room you were in before that has speakers and or headphones and all that, you always sort of guessed and went, okay, this sound is going to sound this way on the dub stage, and hope the best. You cut 2 or 3 different versions of it just for that purpose, because you're like, hey, it sounded great in my room, but I always preface like doing fixes for the dub stage with, it sounds great on my headphones, but let's just see how it sounds in the room. I don't have to do that anymore. I literally will play something and go, well, it sounds exactly the same.
Is there a downside to any of this? Or is there anything specific about this whole new way of working that was a challenge for you at first?
Using the VME, not really. Other than the normal beta testing, how does this work? How does that work? Do you like this level set here or there kind of thing? But nothing, honestly, no challenges. Not even like crashing or anything like that. It's very simple. The interface is very simple. They give you a 2-page instructions how to install it and set it up, and it's quite easy. So no, I didn't have any difficulty with it. And I'll admit, I tend to be fairly technically savvy, not so much as others, but more than a lot. And I think someone who is even much less skilled than myself would be able to manage this without hand-holding or guidance. It's very, very simple. I just wish that it was the kind of thing where you didn't have to go and get calibrated in the exact room. I don't see the solution to that yet. I'm sure that the geniuses will figure it out over at Sony at some point, because it really seemed to be something that they were interested in, and they seemed very hopeful that me trying one would work out better than it in the end it did. But the spirit of trying to make this plugin with the end goal of making mixing accessible to people who don't have the resources to buy the speakers and to buy the space and to soundproof everything and make everything properly dead in your room, making the ability to mix a big feature in a professional space with whatever you have at home is, personally, I think that's amazing. I don't think that you should have to have a degree in electrical engineering in order to become a sound engineer. Make it more like painting with a paintbrush, because everybody can use a paintbrush, but artists make art. It's just a tool.
So I talk a lot with picture editors, as you know, and a common point of debate is within picture editorial doing stereo, LCR, 5.1, and how much audio work, how much sound work would they do in picture? First,
I have a lot of thoughts on this.
I'm sure. Well, good. So the first question is this something that you could see them using? Does it make sense for them to be doing something like this?
Oh, hell yes. So the thing that has been changing through the years, and I'm going to put on my post-supervisor hat to speak to this part of the conversation because I've set up many a cutting room in the past 8 to 10 years. And one thing I love to set up, and they love when we can set it up, is to have that 5.1 editing bay, or they don't like it when you call it a bay.
Suite.
Yeah, it's a suite. Yes, to have that 5.1 in the editor's room at least, and one of the assistants so that they can be listening in 5.1. I personally feel that advantages everybody because you start thinking about sound earlier. It's not just us, the sound team, who needs to be considering it. The director needs to be thinking about it early on. And when the editors can hear their movie in 5.1, when you have that tool, you suddenly want to use it and you want to make use of it. And they're more supportive of these temp mixes that make use of the surrounds. So I think it's a huge benefit to be able to have the editorial and the director team being able to hear what you do in the best environment as well. Not only that, but it just makes it, as Kami says, when you turn something over to anybody from what you were working on, be it to your supervising sound editor, the next person down the line to get the session, the mixer, or the mixer will give a temp mix or a sound design or something to the editor. You don't want to have to say, hey, this sounded great in my headphones, but let me know if something sounds out of whack to you. To be able to remove that element of the conversation a little bit and make sure, and you can hear mixers who over the pandemic, they've been showing their mixes to their producers and their directors using headphones and using VME because it feels like it's easier to represent it accurately when you submit your work for comment and for notes. Because the last thing, you want the notes to be true notes that are a comment on what you what you did.
Not what they can hear.
And not how they heard it. Exactly
yeah,
that.
How they can't hear it in their headphones.
Yes.
Kami, you've seen a lot of changes happen in the industry in your career. How does this rank amongst those big developments? Because there's some big things that have happened as you've been working over these past 20 or so years.
Oh, good question.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was on the dub stage yesterday talking about the fact that, the first sound tools, which was the predecessor to Pro Tools, was a 2-track machine. And then the first Pro Tools was a 4-track machine. And how much, going from cutting audio on tape to computers just opened it up so much for people. I think, like Jess said, the technology enables artists to just use them as tools. And it's not these expensive tools that you have to. I remember the first Mac that I bought. I think I had a 256 megabyte drive that was $5,000. It literally made it impossible for people to just go out and buy and utilize. But now you look at it, and $100,000 systems to cut sound don't exist anymore. You can cut sound on this laptop that you bought used for $700. And these headphones are going to be relatively inexpensive. They're not going to be, $2,000 or $3,000 headphones. They're going to be accessible to everybody. I worked on a movie called Slender Man that Sony had shot. They shot that entire movie on the A7 Sony camera that you can actually just go into a store and buy for $2,000. They shot the entire movie on those cameras. Was it a budgetary thing? No, it was just to prove a point that they could actually do that and enable people to utilize the technology that's relatively inexpensive to make movies and to make product out there, for people to go see and enjoy. And this is the same thing. It really, the past generations of these have been super expensive to buy. The reason I never bought previous generations that weren't Sony, they're I think $4,000 or $5,000 for the setup.
The Smythe thing is you're talking $8,000 to get totally set up for Smythe. Well, that was a long time ago now, but
I know, but I mean, I own a studio. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on equipment a year. I found that to be a little bit of, that's a little too much money to be spending in an edit room. But this is completely a game changer. I really think it's a game changer. It's a game changer in that you take the guesswork out for your clients, for picture editors, for producers, for end users. Everybody's on a level playing field. We were listening to some of the conversations that were going on about mixing during the pandemic. I didn't get that. I didn't get how much of an issue it was for everybody because I kept thinking everybody's on these headphones and I wasn't really thinking about it that much. But it's a huge thing. Like the fact that you're sending things out to people and they're listening to it and they're coming back with notes going, I don't know, it didn't sound right to me. And what headphones were you using? What Mac were you on? All that kind of stuff. It takes it out of that equation completely. And you don't even have to think about that. Like between all of us, when I send a sound over or a mix over to Will to listen to, I know he hears exactly what I heard. So the guesswork of, well, it sounded like this in my room. How does it sound in your room? We don't even have those conversations. It's like, okay, great. That sounds cool. I like that sound that you used.
With so much concern right now on the future of movie theaters and how that's all going to play out, is this the kind of thing where in the home theater environment, you see the consumer having headphones like these, being able to sort of experience what you're doing?
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, I know that that's the conversation, that like there is technology that's going into mapping your head and all that kind of stuff, and for the end user to be able to hear exactly within 90% of hearing how it's heard in an actual room.
Also, the headphones are open back, so it's not. It doesn't really exclude you from interacting with your environment. So,
well, I've been stuck in this house for 4 months with 2 kids. I just assume not interact with my environment. So. Well, no matter what your current environment is, I hope you enjoyed our foray into the world of sound editing and all the cool new tools and technology that's out there. A big global thank you to Justin Webster, Jess Parks, and Kami Asgar for joining us today. To learn more about Matchbox and all the other great audio and post-production tools that Justin develops, visit the Cargo Cult. And to learn more about Sony's virtual mixing environment, and to see some videos of Jess and Kami working away, I'll put a link in the show notes where you can do just that. Whether you are just about to begin your career in video editing or sound editing, or you've already started your journey in one and are curious to learn more about the other, Avid has 2 great apps for you, and they're free. Media Composer First and Pro Tools First. Software for free that can actually help you make money. Why aren't more things in life like that? Who knows? But I do know this. We should do this again sometime. How about next week? Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.